Hi everybody. To finish up this week of our Research Foundations lessons, we are going to discuss how we can evaluate and then summarize, and how we can summarize in different ways our sources that we will be utilizing for our oral presentations throughout the semester. So what we're going to take a look at today is quotations, paraphrases, and summaries. And so those are all three a little bit different, and we'll get into the differences between those in just a little bit. But first I want to kind of discuss why it is important to use quotations, paraphrases, and summaries from your sources. So all three of these can provide support for claims and add credibility to your work. It also refers to work that leads up to the work you are now doing, since these quotations, paraphrases, and summaries are coming directly from sources that you have researched on your topic. They're also a good way to give examples of several points of view on a subject. Also, call attention to a position that you wish to agree or disagree with. And lastly, a great way to highlight a particularly striking phrase, sentence, or passage by quoting the original source. And so now let's start breaking down the differences between quotations, paraphrases, and summaries. So when you're quoting a source, quotations must be identical to the original. So the key word there is identical. And they must match the source document word for word. So the only time you're going to quote sources, though, is when the quote is short, simple, and memorable, and you always must attribute the quote to the original author from the source that you're reading. And of course, direct quotes often have quotation marks within them. We'll talk a little bit how you'll cite sources within an oral speech later on in the presentation, but you always know it's a direct quote if you're reading something by those quotation marks, or if the speaker uses I quote. So I'll just provide you a few examples. So these are quotes from famous people that most of us probably know, and these are good examples of specific quotes from either something they wrote, something they said. You can tell that these are all impactful. So the one on the left, Will Ferrell, this one has a little bit more humor to it, but still an impactful part of his sketch that he did. And then of course, we recognize Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein obviously said a lot of things throughout his work, but there are certain quotes that stand out to us. And then, of course, Robin Williams. So go ahead and take a second, read these, just to kind of get an idea of what type of content is normal to quote. Okay, and so next we're going to talk about paraphrasing sources. So paraphrasing is when you put a passage from source material into your own words. So it's not necessarily going to be word for word, but you're going to still want to use similar language so that you're still getting the same point across. It's often a better choice than using a direct quote because it allows for simplified language. But once again, when you do paraphrase a source, you still must attribute the content to the original author from your source. So let's provide an example of paraphrasing. So this is going to be a very simple example, but I feel like it still gets the point across. So let's take our original sentence, my dog ate his food quickly. A good way to paraphrase this would be to say, my dog speedily gulped his food. And so the key point with paraphrasing is that the sentences must have the same meaning, even though you're using different words. So in this example, we replace the word quickly and ate with speedily gulped. different words, but these words still have the same meaning to get the same meaning across. Next, let's talk about summarizing sources. So summarizing and paraphrasing can be similar, but there is a difference between the two types of recounting sources. And so with summarizing, that involves putting the main ideas into your own words, including only the main points. So what happens when you summarize, typically you're going to summarize a longer passage. What you're going to focus on is discussing the main points of the passage and putting those into your own words. So as we know, summaries are significantly shorter than the original content. Think about how there's abstracts at the beginning of journal articles, so that tiny paragraph is able to put those main points that are contained in the article into a significantly shorter paragraph than typically 20 pages. And once again, when you summarize a source, you still must attribute to the authors of the original source. So you have to give credit to the original authors. Even though you're using your own words, you are still discussing work that has been done by someone else. So let's take a look at an example of summarizing. So I'll read these paragraphs out loud for you. So here's the original paragraph. Skipping breakfast might seem like an easy way for dieters to cut calories. However, new research finds that the majority of people who are successful at losing weight and keeping it off eat breakfast every day. Now, here's how we would summarize that paragraph. Research shows that people who wish to lose weight do not skip breakfast. So as you can see, the original paragraph is 36 words, but our summary, we've cut that in less than half the amount of words, so 12 words. But what you can tell from this example is that summarized paragraph, it's telling you the main point of what was said in the original paragraph, which is that people who are trying to lose weight should not skip breakfast. So now that we've discussed the differences between quotations, paraphrasing, and summarizing, I do want to discuss a little bit about summary versus paraphrase, because I know that this can be a little bit difficult to know the differences between the two because they are similar. But here is a good chart that is going to explain the difference between summary versus paraphrase. So the main points is that summary is a brief statement versus a rewording of a text. Now, you may still use different words when you're summarizing a certain passage, but remember, what you're going to focus on is the key points. Also, as we mentioned, summary is going to be shorter, while a paraphrase is typically going to be longer than a summary. And a summary is going to be more selective, as in you are cutting out some other content within the passage because you're just focusing on those key points, while paraphrasing has to be more specific because you are still clarifying the original content of the source just with a few different words. And lastly, summary is going to condense the text, while a paraphrase clarifies the text. So the condensing the text relates to the fact that, of course, summaries are going to be shorter than a paraphrase and more selective. With paraphrasing, you're clarifying the text. It's kind of like when you are in class and a teacher will provide multiple examples of the same point, so that way maybe someone will understand an example better than another example. So paraphrasing, you're using different words, but you're still getting the same meaning across in hopes that there will still be the understanding of the meaning. And it's important to know the difference between summary versus paraphrasing, because ultimately You will use both in your oral presentations throughout the semester. So don't ever think that you're going to just summarize or just paraphrase a source. Typically, you are always going to use a little bit of both. And so for in class, we are practicing this. So I will post the link to an article if you all want to do this for some practice and let me know how it goes. But I have an article. It's actually about a cow in a backseat of a car through a McDonald's drive-thru. So it is a kind of interesting and funny article. But in class, I'm going to have the students quote from the news article, paraphrase the second paragraph, and summarize the news article. So I will post that link for your all's reference if you want to do that for some extra practice. Now, I know it can be difficult how to decide which we should use, whether we should summarize, paraphrase, or quote a passage. So I have found this chart, and I think it's a great way to break down kind of when, how to decide which you should use. So over here on the left, you have your information, your passage from a reliable source that you know you want to use to support your topic. And then consider these three elements within these arrows to decide what you're going to use. So if it's a very long selection of text, it's probably best to summarize and use your own words to retell the main ideas. You're never going to want to direct quote a super long selection of text. And if it's a shorter selection of text and you want to put it into your own words, that's when you're going to paraphrase. And remember, match the source's meaning, but use your own words, and it's usually going to be the same length as the original source. So that's why if it is a long selection of text, you know you're going to summarize. And then lastly, if it's short and specific, or if it's an impactful piece of evidence, go ahead and use a quotation. And remember, word for word for quotations, you should never quote more than a few sentences at a time. If the selection is more than a few sentences, likely you're going to want to choose to paraphrase. And then, of course, if it's a few paragraphs, you're typically going to want to choose to summarize. And now we're going to transition a little bit. We're going to talk about citing those different types of sources when we do decide to paraphrase, summarize, or quote. And I want you to think about for a second, why are citations so important within academic work? Here's the simple answer. Ultimately, to prevent plagiarism. If you noticed, all three of the quotations, summary, and paraphrasing that we discussed had something in common. And that is that you must attribute the source to the original author. You have to cite your source. And why are oral citations so important in a speech class? It's to prevent plagiarism. And if you all know what plagiarism is, according to Merriam-Webster.com dictionary, it's to steal and pass of the ideas or words of another as one's own, or to use another's production without crediting the source. And if you all reviewed the syllabus, you know there was an academic honesty section in there. Here at State Tech, especially within the comm department, we do take plagiarism very seriously because it is a very big deal within academics to not plagiarize. And I understand that sometimes plagiarism isn't always intentional. However, if you do forget to cite a source in a speech or in an assignment, an essay in your other classes, it is going to be considered plagiarism either way. So, oral citations are so important in a speech class because the oral citation conveys the reliability, validity, and currency of your information. Citing your sources orally lets your audience know that you have researched your topic and also will prevent you from committing plagiarism. So, Now let's discuss how we would cite in a speech. I know this may be new information for some of you, so that's why we're going to go over it. But how you want to cite in a speech is you always want to tell the audience your source before you use the information, which is the opposite of in-text citations that appear in parentheses after. Also, you're always going to want to provide enough information about each source so that your audience could, with little effort, find them. So that's going to include the author's name, a brief explanation of their credentials, the title of the work, and publication date. Also, additionally, if your source is unknown to your audience, provide enough information about your source for the audience to perceive them as credible. So typically what you're going to want to do is state the source's qualifications to discuss the topic. So we will go over a few examples within the next slide. First, so when you cite a direct quote, paraphrase, or summary, you are always going to utilize all of these bullet points here. But there are some differences that you'll need to add when citing, depending on what you're citing. So direct quotes should be acknowledged as, and I quote, or as title of source put it. Obviously, with quotations in speeches, we're not going to see those quotations, but I do not want you to say quote, unquote when you offer a direct quotation. Oftentimes, you can use brief pauses instead. So here's an example. In an article in the November 2020 issue of the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, Dr. Roger Junior Sorella, a professor of social psychology at the University of Kent, says, and I quote, "As an institution, our field could do more to support representation and equality, both within itself and in society at large." So here is a great example of the elements that we discussed on this slide here. As you can tell, we told the audience about our source before we gave the quote. We provided the author's name and his expertise. He's a professor of psychology, and where the article was published and the date. So that's a great example of utilizing all those elements that we discussed previously and a direct quote. Next, how do we cite when we are paraphrasing and summarizing in a speech? So once again, you're going to use all of those original elements we just discussed, but you will need to refer to your academic sources throughout the entire speech. It can be easy to forget to cite when you are paraphrasing since it's not a direct quote, but you still need to cite. So we will hear citations throughout the speech. So here's an example of paraphrase or how to cite a paraphrasing or summary in a speech without a direct quote. According to the Tourette Syndrome Fact Sheet, last updated March 17th, 2020 by the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, symptoms of Tourette syndrome include tics such as eye blinking, facial grimacing, shoulder shrugging, and head jerking. So we can tell from this example that this is likely a summary because the speaker focused on the main symptoms of Tourette syndrome instead of going into details maybe about each symptom and why they happen. We just have the main points. These are the symptoms, boom, boom, boom. But as you can see, we still used those original elements. We provided background information on the source before the information. We cited the title of the article and gave credibility by referencing the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and also provided the date. So in class we're going to do an activity, so I will also allow you guys to do this by providing you the link to this YouTube video, but we are going to watch a YouTube video, How to Have a Good Conversation, and this is a TED Talk, and she uses quite a few different cite sources, so she does paraphrase, summarize, and use direct quotes in her speech. So I'm going to have the class jot down examples of her utilizing quotations, citations, and paraphrases and summaries within her speech, And so I will provide you all with this link so that you can take a look at this. It is a really good example of how to do that in an oral presentation. And then I am going to go ahead and post your summary, paraphrase, quote assignment in Canvas. So go ahead and take a look at that and let me know if you have any questions.